Did giants really disappear after the 1800s? Or is that just another story people repeat without ever checking what actually exists as evidence? Because here's the uncomfortable truth when it comes to giants. Most of what we hear comes from legends, old texts, and stories passed down through generations. But when you start looking for solid, documented proof, things get a lot more complicated. And a lot less clear than conspiracy videos would have you believe, for example, in the 1800s and early. 1900 Sekunde. Newspapers in the United States published multiple reports claiming that unusually large human skeletons had been discovered during excavations, with some articles describing bones far bigger than an average human, sometimes linked to ancient burial mounds, especially in places like the Ohio Valley. These reports are real, they were printed, they circulated, and they caught public attention at the time. But here is where the doubt comes in. Most of those findings were never properly verified by modern science. Many were later dismissed, exaggerated, or simply disappeared from the historical record without clear explanation. Across different parts of the world, there are buildings from before the 1800s that seem partially buried, with lower levels hidden underground and architectural features that don't match. The idea that they were always meant to be that way, which leads some researchers to suggest that a large-scale event, often called the Mudflood, may have covered entire portions of cities. But here's the critical point. There is no official historical record of a global mudflood event. No widely accepted documentation that confirms it as a real, singular catastrophe, which forces us to ask whether we are looking at misunderstood urban development or fragments of something that hasn't been fully explained. Because if there was no mudflood, then why do so many cities show similar signs of buried structures? And if there is no solid proof of giants, then why do so many historical accounts insist they once existed? At some point, the line between myth and evidence starts to blur, and the real question is no longer what we believe, but what can actually be proven and what might have been lost, misinterpreted, or simply ignored over time. If you enjoy exploring strange photos from the past and unusual discoveries, consider subscribing to the channel, because here we take a closer look at forgotten details that might change the way we see the past. If we're going to take this idea seriously, even for a moment, then we need to separate what sounds convincing from what can actually be checked. And that starts by looking at the so-called evidence that people often use to support the idea of giants. One of the most common references comes from old newspaper articles, especially from the 1800s, where reports described the discovery of unusually large skeletons, sometimes found during construction, farming, or the excavation of ancient burial mounds. At first glance, this seems important, because these reports were not hidden, they were published openly, read by thousands of people, and in some cases even connected to early archaeological work in the United States. But when modern researchers went back to examine these claims more carefully, most of them ran into the same problem. There were no preserved skeletons, no verifiable records, and no physical evidence that could be studied today. In many cases, what remained were just the articles themselves, often written during a time when newspapers were known for exaggeration, storytelling, and sometimes even completely fabricated discoveries designed to attract attention. This doesn't automatically mean everything was fake, but it does mean we have to be careful, because without physical proof, it becomes almost impossible to confirm what was actually found. Now, there is one real and well-documented part of this story that often gets mixed into these claims, and that is the existence of ancient burial mounds across North America. Built by indigenous cultures long before modern cities existed, these mounds were studied by archaeologists, and they did contain human remains, tools and artifacts, but the skeletons found there were, in general, within the normal human size range. Not evidence of a race of giants. Real locations, real excavations, real historical context, but mixed with reports that cannot be verified. Descriptions that may have been exaggerated, and conclusions that go far beyond what the evidence actually supports. Because if the evidence for giants is weak or uncertain, then why do so many people still connect it to something like the Mudflood? To understand that, we need to look at the second piece of the puzzle, not bones this time, but buildings, cities, and something that you can still see with your own eyes today. If the idea of giants depends mostly on weak or missing evidence, the same cannot be said about the buildings, because this time, we are not dealing with stories or old newspaper articles. We are dealing with physical structures that still exist, that you can visit, photograph, and examine for yourself. In city after city, across Europe, the United States, and even parts of Asia, there are buildings where the lower level sits below the current street, with windows half buried, doors that lead into what is now underground, and entire floors that look like they were never meant to be basements. At first, this feels strange, because the design doesn't always match what we expect from a building that was planned that way, especially when you see full-sized windows and detailed architecture placed in areas that are now covered by soil. This is where the Mudflood idea starts to gain attention. Not because there is direct proof of a global disaster, but because the visual pattern is real and it repeats in different places. Throughout the 1800s, several cities went through major changes, including street elevation projects where roads were raised to improve drainage, reduce flooding, and modernize infrastructure, especially after problems with sewage and water buildup. In places like Chicago, for example, entire blocks were physically lifted, buildings included, sometimes by several feet, in order to rebuild the city at a higher level, and this process is well documented, with photos, engineering records, and written accounts. In other cities, layers of dirt, debris, and construction gradually built up over time, raising street levels while older parts of buildings became buried below. So what looks like a sudden event may, in many cases, be the result of slow, practical changes made over decades. Even with these explanations, not every example fits perfectly. And not every buried structure has a clear, detailed record explaining exactly how and when it ended up below ground. At this point, we have two important pieces on the table, and neither of them fully proves anything on its own, but together they create just enough doubt to keep the question alive. On one side, we have the idea of giants, supported mostly by old reports, scattered stories, and claims that were never properly confirmed, which makes it very hard to treat them as solid evidence. On the other side, we have real buildings, real cities, and visible structures that seem partially buried, with some clear explanations, but also with gaps that are not always fully documented. And this is exactly where theories like the Mudflood begin to take shape, not from strong proof, but from the space between what we can explain and what we cannot. Because for some people, the official explanations feel incomplete, especially when they see the same patterns repeating in different countries, different climates, and different historical contexts. They start asking a different kind of question, not just how these buildings became buried, but why does this pattern exist at all? And this is where the theory begins to evolve into something much bigger. Instead of isolated cases of construction and urban change, it becomes the idea of a large-scale event, something that may have affected multiple regions, covering parts of cities and possibly erasing evidence of whatever existed before. For a theory like that to hold up, especially on a global scale, we would expect to find consistent records, geological evidence, or at least some kind of agreement across historical documents from different parts of the world. There is no widely accepted scientific data showing a global mud-based catastrophe in the 1800s. No layer of sediment that appears everywhere at the same time, and no clear historical accounts describing such an event happening on that scale. What we do find instead are local events, floods, landslides, rebuilding efforts, and urban development projects that can explain many, but not all, of the cases people point to. If we move one step further, the real question is no longer just about giants or buried buildings, but about how history is actually recorded, preserved, and sometimes lost over time. Because when people look at the past, there is often an assumption that everything important was documented clearly, stored safely, and passed down without gaps. But that is not how history really works. In the 1800s, record-keeping was far less consistent than it is today. Many events were documented locally, some were never recorded at all, and others were lost due to fires, wars, or simple neglect. Entire archives have disappeared over time, and in many cities, especially older ones. There are known gaps in documentation where we simply do not have complete records explaining how certain changes happened. Because while some cities like Chicago and Seattle have clear, well-documented reasons for their buried lower levels, others do not have the same level of detail, which leaves space for interpretation. Just because we don't have a full record does not automatically mean something was covered up. It can also mean that the details were never properly recorded in the first place. And this is where many theories begin to take a stronger shape than the evidence allows. When people see patterns like similar buried structures in different places, and combine that with incomplete records, the mind naturally tries to connect those points into a single explanation. That explanation can feel convincing because it creates a clear and simple story out of scattered pieces. Different cities can arrive at similar results for completely different reasons. And over time, those separate stories can start to look like one single event even when they are not connected. Because unlike buildings, which still exist and can be examined, the idea of giants depends almost entirely on reports that cannot be tested today, and that makes it much easier for assumptions to fill the gaps. After looking at all of this, the buried buildings, the old reports, the missing records, and the explanations that exist alongside the ones that don't, what remains is not a clear answer, but something much more uncomfortable. Because the deeper you go, the more you realize that this is not a story about proving that giants existed, or confirming that a mudflood really happened. It is about understanding how easily the line between fact and assumption can start to disappear. We have real cities with parts of their past hidden below ground, and in some cases we know exactly why that happened, while in others, the explanation is incomplete or simply lost over time. We have historical reports that talk about discoveries that sound extraordinary, but without the physical evidence needed to confirm them today, and between those two there is a space where questions grow, a space where patterns begin to form, and a space where people try to connect what they can see with what they cannot prove. Because the truth is, history is not a perfect record, it is a reconstruction built from what survived, what was documented, and what was never lost. And that means there will always be gaps. The real question is what we do with those gaps. Do we treat them as missing pieces that still need to be understood? Or do we fill them with answers that feel right, even when the evidence is not strong enough to support them? And maybe the most important question of all is this. If something truly unusual had existed in the past, something that didn't fit what we accept today, would we recognize it in the evidence we have now? Or would it already be buried, not just under layers of earth, but under layers of interpretation, assumption, and time. If you enjoy exploring questions like this, where the line between history and mystery is not always clear, then following the channel is a simple way to keep going deeper into these kinds of discoveries, because there are many. More stories, details, and overlooked pieces of the past that still deserve a closer look. And each one has the potential to change how we understand what really came before us.